never should have cured my tonight. Tonight is a nightmare of a disease affecting millions of people, myself included. How could I best describe this condition? And incessant mail on chalkboards screeching that goes on for every minute of every day. Just imagine never experiencing the true bliss of utter silence. Maybe it's not too uncommon to hear a faint ringing, especially for people like me who had grown up to become an obnoxious teenager with no regard for volume control. Understandably, my parents were not happy about my blasting la music at all hours. But what kind of teenage rebel would I have been if I listened to my parents? Ultimately, my punishment would be given years later when I started hearing a faint ringing. At first, it was a rare occurrence, but at present day, I can't even fall asleep without the aid of a loud wing noise-producing machine. Even then, my quality of rest is too beatable at best. During the early days, I was willing to try anything to stop the godforsaken noise rainstorms while sleeping. Your wife's removal, even a small dose of antidepressants. Nothing worked. You'd be amazed how many help groups you can find online, forums for anything, veterans with PTSD, how to cope with losing a pet, or in my case, how to deal with tinnitus. I've looked over the top suggestions on several occasions. Most I had already tried while visiting my doctor, while the rest were mostly scams, better suited for multi-level marketing campaigns. I used to call myself an optimist, so naturally I would return to the forum every other week in hopes of finding a miracle cure. On one particular day, I decided to scroll a bit further down and see the less popular suggestions among the obvious troll posts and scam cures. I found a more clippy post that read, "A weird trick to cure tonight is nothing more, nothing less." I saw it and started reading, preparing myself to be disappointed again. Still, the instructions were simple enough. Place your palms over your ears and direct your fingers to the back of your head. Put your index fingers on top of your middle fingers and try to snap them like a drum. Repeat 50 to 100 times. There were no comments below as the post was relatively new. Worst case, I would look stupid sitting there by myself and drumming the back of my head. So I tried it out, snapping my fingers and causing a little drumming sensation. 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50. That ought to do it. I removed my palms from my ears and listened intently. Nothing. For the first time in years, there was just a pure bliss of silence. 4 minutes. I just sat back in order, not believing what I was hearing, or more accurately, not hearing that the trick actually worked. I decided that rather than enjoying my newfound silence, I would keep my brain above as her solid rest. And that's exactly what I did. I thought like a baby that night until around 2 in the morning. Might tend to wake up randomly during the night, so it caused a little concern to my disappointment, but not surprise. The screeching have returned. At best, I had half expected the solution to be a temporary one. I simply performed the witchcraft trick again and once more. The ringing was calm without a trace. With a sigh of relief, I settled back into bed. The sound that had haunted me for so long had been easily defeated by a helpful, anonymous person online. And I was content only then to realize that I wasn't enveloped in complete silence. Rather, there was something else cowering in the dark, only making its presence known by a soft thump. Could it be my own heartbeat? After all these years, were I now be haunted by a new sound? I'll 3 fingers on my neck and felt a pulse. It didn't match the sound in the darkness, although I tried placing a sound proved to be a challenge. With each passing thump, I tried to pinpoint its origin a bit more precisely. I went so far as to open every cupboard in my apartment, checked in the hallways, and lastly placed my ear against the wall. No sooner did my ear touch the wall. Before the sound stopped, my heart raced alongside my logical mind. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe it was been a busted pipe or one of my neighbors being a prickling at night. No matter the cause, it was time for bed. In the morning, the ringing returned. I figured I could put the noise at bay by performing the trick every 6 hours. It quickly became a routine of mine to stupidly tap my head when no one was looking, and it worked. Everything was great, apart from my nightly routine of waking up around 2 and hearing the same thumping softly keeping me company in the darkness. Most nights I simply ignored it, but other nights curiosity got the better of me, and I pursued the sound. Each night, I once again failed to locate the sound. I simply couldn't place it, and I couldn't be bothered to stay up long enough to figure out why it started and why it ended. I tried to talk my neighbors into investigation, but they scoffed at the idea of waking at such long hours. That's were another possibility, but after a quick visit by pest control, they assured me there were no rodents living within the walls. In fact, after looking at the building plans, they insisted that it would be impossible for rats to live inside these walls. As a last resort, I decided I would record myself sleeping. I'd heard there were a bunch of apps that only record you if there's a noise, so I figured it would be ideal for the situation. I downloaded a free app and went to bed just like every night before I woke up around 2 a.m., but decided I would ignore the sound and let my phone do its work. I had some earplugs that came in handy, and without further troubles I fell asleep, after waking up the following morning. I brewed myself a much-needed cup of coffee and sat down, figuring I could run the recording through audio editing software to look at the amplitude of the sound waves rather than listening through it all. The thump started around midnight and kept going for several hours. Aside from that, I mostly found sounds of myself shifting around in bed. However, at 3:30 a.m., there was a short pause consisting of complete silence, as if every sound had been erased from existence. It was no more than a minute before the sound returned, but it was no longer a soft thumping. It sounded more like whispering, just incomprehensible voices talking to no one in particular. Must be tired. I couldn't make out what was said on the recording. My phone wasn't exactly a technological wonder. In fact, I had no interest in finding out if anything. I would have preferred to leave the apartment and forget about the whole thing, but being a poor student without any nearby family, I had no other option than to stay put. Besides, I still thought there might be a logical explanation. After some hesitation, I came to the ridiculous conclusion that if I could hear the actual whispering, I could probably locate the culprits. So when I came, I went to bed fully expecting to be awoken at the usual time. And from then I would search for the source of the noise. It was 2 a.m. rolled around. I was woken by the familiar eerie thumping where I had once been a welcome, intriguing part of my nightly routine and have now become a dreaded enemy. It was relentless, not stopping for a single second, and as before, I had trouble identifying the exact location it was emanating from, like an auditory illusion. It seemed to echo throughout the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. At precisely 331, the sound abruptly came to a halt. I held my breath in anticipation, waiting for the mysterious voice to start talking. As expected, the whispers began. Unlike the thumps, however, I could immediately discern their origin. They came from a wall directly behind my bed. I knew there couldn't possibly exist anything behind the wall, no apartment, more crawl space, just a concrete barrier separating my room from the outdoors. I crawled onto my bed with caution, as if approaching a wild animal, and carefully pressed my ear to the wall. The whispers started to become more focused, morphing into a single understandable phrase. "We know you can finally hear us." It sounded like several broken voices merged into a singular entity. I jolted back on my bed, where I remained frozen in fear. "Thank you for letting us in," the voices continued before falling silent. I began to feel faint, and it took me a while to realize I hadn't been breathing for quite some time. I forced a gasp, bringing air into my lungs, and tried desperately to calm down while trying to come up with a plan. The thumping returned only this time, Ira, exactly where it came from. The soft steps turned into loud, tearing along the inside of the wall. It moved with each step, working its way towards the hallway outside my bedroom. I could think we make our shadow beneath the door as it moved past it. I always keep my bedroom door locked, a habit formed during my time spent living with intriguing family members. But I knew that wouldn't stop whatever abomination I had let loose simply by acknowledging its presence. The creature started knocking on the door, a playful thump with each knock, why I've become accustomed to over the past few weeks. It spoke to me with its now familiar broken voice. "It's too late to lock us out now," they said. "What do you want?" I stared back. "What are you? We are the acolytes. We just wanted to be heard. We've waited so long, it struck the dawn, and small cracks appear around the hinges. We have always been here." The voices cried in unison. "Why are you afraid?" Another violent punch in the upper hinge broke off the doorframe. I would have called the police, or anyone for that matter, but I inconveniently left my phone in my jacket pocket. So I threw on whatever clothes I have lying on the floor and clambered out the window and down the fire escape. I wasn't taking any chances with whatever was on the opposite side of my door. As I made my descent, I heard my bedroom door splinter. "Where are you?" The things I yelled. "We have come for you." I never looked back. After my escape, I made my way to a nearby gas station and used their phone to dial the police. I told them, without going into specifics, that there had been an intruder in my apartment and explained how I have fled down the fire escape. When they checked the apartment, however, there was no one to be found. The door to my bedroom was shattered, but there were no other signs of forced entry and no indication that anything else had been damaged or stolen. To make matters worse, my apartment's overall state of disrepair made it difficult for the police to accept my story at face value. They had to break down the front door to get in, and I knew my landlord would be pissed. But I didn't care about that. After a very brief investigation, which involved checking the security camera footage to confirm that no one could possibly have entered my apartment, I was let off with a warning not to prank. Call the police again. Another cop offered me the number for a local psychiatric facility while the police were there. I grabbed a bag and filled it with a pair of essentials. I left that night to return home to my parents, intending to spend the rest of the night at the train station. I never returning to that place. I've caught my way of explaining that they can keep my deposit along with whatever stuff I left behind. A few days passed after I left the apartment behind. Before long, my tonight has returned louder than ever, and at first I couldn't have been happier about by allowing myself to hear the entities I had inadvertently let them in. I accepted my condition as a bittersweet blessing as it hit the things that go thump in the night, and if I couldn't hear them, they couldn't find me either. Unfortunately, my relief proved to be short-lived. As it turned out, the ringing was no longer enough to silence the voices. Last night I woke up to a strange sound. At 3:30 a.m., we found you the lake. Curtisology has always been a major interest of mine. I say minor because it was something I'd only enjoyed casually, a few internet articles here and there. Scrolling through a couple of pages on Tumblr blog dedicated to it, maybe watching one of those Bigfoot documentaries. You know, that kind of interest. Nothing serious. Generally, that would be pretty common for most people. Most people, however, do not live in my little town where supposed cricket is. How many folks here make a living? See, I live in a small town in the UK, more specifically in the northwest of England. It's a tiny place not many people outside of the country have likely heard of unless they've already been there for whatever reason or have an interest in cryptids. My small town is situated by one of the many lakes that dot this part of the country and has so many bodies of water too. We have our own Loch Ness monster. So many people claim. Anyway, I'm sure many of you are skeptical of that as you are of any such monster. Who can blame you? I grew up here. I didn't buy into that. I found it interesting, but I didn't believe it. Same as I didn't believe those people who claim aliens prove their backsides or that Bigfoot had destroyed their camp. It was something to read about and enjoy, but not something I believed. Most of my generation and that of my parents felt the same, but many of my grandparents. Eric clung to the belief in the monster. They stayed away from the lake, unless they were in decently sized boats, or one of the many ferries that traveled the length of the lake to nearby settlements. Now, as kids and teens, though especially not in summer, most of the time, British summers are nothing to brag about. They're pretty warm, but usually cloudy or white. Sometimes, however, we were blessed with a heat wave. Nothing was better than a dip in the lake during the heat of the day during the school holidays. The older kids would hang out by the lake well into the evening. The worst that ever happened was that someone would get a cramp while swimming and we'd have to give them back to Sean, or someone would get their foot tangled in some lake weed and freak out until they realized what it actually was. Nothing sinister, nothing serious, most certainly no lake monster. One particular day during the Easter break, where it was much too cold to spend more than 5 minutes at a time in the lake, I was spending my time climbing the many tall trees that covered the areas around the lakes. Maybe I was a bit old for tree climbing, most likely, but it had always been something I enjoyed doing. Something about climbing as high as I could go and settling down on a tree branch, just looking over my surroundings, was something I enjoyed. Most of the time I just watched boats going up and down the lake, people going about their business. Cars passing down the country, roads, just typical stuff, not worthy of merit. But this time, spring was different. The day itself was like any other. A chilly but sunny day in late March. I'd already taken up my temporary church in an old oak, where I stay for an hour or so before going off to meet friends from where I was perched. I could see two young kids, maybe around 8 or 9, playing down by the shore. They weren't close to the water, just sitting in the grassy area, a little ways off the bank. Two girls. I couldn't really see what they were doing beyond the general observation. This was nothing out of the ordinary. What was unusual was the large dapple gray horse driving along the shoreline towards them. Horses weren't exactly an unusual sight themselves out in a rural town, but they were usually in their fields or accompanied by a rider. There was no one else in sight, and this horse had no saddle, bridle, or any other sort of riding gear. There are no true wild horses in the United Kingdom, and the only semi-wild horses make their home in the New Forest. Some were right at the other side of the country. That left the option of it having somehow gotten out of its field. For all that seemed weird to me, in hindsight it wasn't all that unusual. Tourists were always crossing through private land and leaving gates open. Animals were bound to get on occasion. The kids took immediate notice of the animal, looking up from their chatter and letting out delighted squeals. I could hear even from my spot up in the tree. As I watched as they ran up to it, fearless as all children were oblivious to the fact that they spooked one kid from its front or back legs could show their developing bones. I watched as the pair gleefully pet the animal. The horse itself didn't seem to mind the attention, which led me to think it was one frequently used for riding. Most likely one of the horses rented out to tourists so they could enjoy a ride through the countryside. The horse lowered its head, allowing the kids to press a hand to its muzzle. I could hear their delight of laughter as the pair took turns alternating between stroking its flank and head. It was pretty cute, I have to admit. There's always something magical about an unfamiliar animal being content with your presence without commas, or seemed to be, I think, badly as it lowered itself to the ground. A pair of kids seemed ecstatic about this, climbing onto the animal's back. Not exactly safe or smart, but kids don't really think like that, and I'm sure the horse would have made it very clear it didn't want them clambering over it if it wanted to. It was a pretty damn big horse. It took me a few moments to realize the children were no longer living. See, I happy squeals and giggles. They were screaming. I couldn't understand why at first, but as my vision focused more on the horse, I knew I hadn't noticed the change. I don't know, but where? Once it had been dapple gray, it was now black, the kind of black that seems to absorb all light around it, destroying it. It seemed to be dripping wet even from my spot in the tree. I could see the tangled mess of its waterlogged mane, entailed leaking water onto the ground. Its eyes were the worst of it. I shouldn't have been able to see them clearly from such a distance, but even in the dull spring sun, I could see the glowing from those sickening milky eyes. Its roots head back, rising to its feet with the children still on its back. They were trying to get off, but they couldn't. I don't know how, and I'm sure they didn't know either, but no matter how much they struggled and screamed, they couldn't get off of that horse. It was like they were super glued to it. I couldn't move from my spot, no matter how much my mind screamed at me to jump down and do something, anything. I'm ashamed to admit fear consumed me. Sweat dripped down my brow as my breathing grew more rapid by the second. My heart was beating so hard and fast that it hurt. I have no proper words to describe the primal terror that gripped me. The same terror I imagine gripped our ancestors when confronted by a giant cave bear or an angry mammoth, though where their fight or flight instinct would kick in. Mine didn't. I was simply frozen. Frozen as the beast charged towards the water, screaming children on its back, their cries not silenced until their heads dipped under the water. Water that frothed and bubbled as they traveled beneath the surface. Then nothing, just an eerie stillness on that spring morning, not even the birds saying I think they knew animals. Just know these things. I don't know how all this happened, that tree just staring out over the water where the horse had vanished into the murk. I don't know what became of those kids, but I know they were never found, and that they never will be. It was written off as accidental drowning. Their parents beat themselves up over it, as any parent would. Nothing like this had ever happened before in our little community. Kids who grew up around the lake pretty much knew how to swim by the time they could walk, and they need to be careful by the water. It didn't add up, of course, but beyond that, no one could explain it. I think the parents cling to the hope that their children simply ran away or were kidnapped so that they might one day find them again. And I can't blame them for that. I never told anyone what I saw. No one would have believed me anyway, save for a few ancient crones nobody took seriously, who frequently babbled about ghosts and ghouls. It haunts me that I did nothing, that I simply watched as those innocent children were pulled into a watery grave. I never went into the lake after that to anyone that asked. I simply said that I didn't like the way the smell of the lake water clung to me. I didn't think I'd ever tell this story, but I still live in this town over a decade later. And last night I saw two apple-green horse stalking along the lakeside.